All right, it's time to start. Kez shouldn't need a lot of introduction. He's been a great supporter of the Zoom program for the years we've been running it. 40 years as a history teacher. He must have started early. He's been very involved as well as being a teacher with teacher training and made an outstanding contribution to the teaching of history. He's got a lifelong interest in all things military and Navy, speaker at the museum. And just to round out what Kez does, he's a musician playing in pubs and other places and a motor enthusiast. So over to you, Kez.
Okay, thanks for coming for the presentation today on the Battle of the Atlantic. Many historians would say probably, certainly for Western allies, the most important campaign of World War II. So let's move on and see what we're going to be checking out today. So first we'll look at the German naval strategy between 1939 to 1941. This was a bit of a flawed strategy to begin with. We will see how German surface units were not very effective, and indeed many of the most important German capital ships were sunk. And of course, this would lead to the bringing in of the German submarines or U-boats. And here we will see really in the first couple of years of the war, how they almost single-handedly, well, if not won the war for Germany, but certainly were on the way to crippling the Western Allied war effort. And then, of course, the Western Allies, principally Britain to start with, but eventually America, when they got their act together, would form up the convoy system. And this would take a while to become effective, but effective it would be, and would therefore turn the tables. But in 1942, and I mentioned the Americans, of course, America entered the war after Pearl Harbor, and President Roosevelt, with the concurrence, of course, of Churchill, who was very happy about it, decided that Germany should be defeated first. But unfortunately, the United States Navy in the Atlantic area of operations did not take to heart the lessons that Britain had already learned, and certainly that the Americans themselves had learned during World War I, and they would be handed again a series of crushing defeats as far as the number of Allied merchant shipping, mostly American at this time, sunk, and the German operations off the coast of the United States would be called Operation Drumbeat. And finally, we will look at how the Battle of the Atlantic was won. As I've said before, this battle lasted for the whole duration of the war, from 1939 all the way to the end of the war in Europe in 1945. So here's our Prime Minister, Churchill, who of course became the Prime Minister in 1940. He wasn't Prime Minister to begin with, although he was the first member of the Admiralty, as far as the government was concerned at the beginning of the war. And his quote here, "The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril." And of course, that's a pretty big statement from him, considering there are a lot of frightening things that happened. And of course, some of those were thanks to Churchill himself, but I won't go there, I suppose. So what was German naval strategy at the beginning of the war? Well, they were realistic enough to realize that the German Navy, or the Kriegsmarine, was in no way able to challenge the Royal Navy as they had tried to do in World War I. They did realize that their best option was that merchant shipping to Britain and from the British Empire to Britain and backwards and forth needed to be sunk. And wherever possible, of course, if they could destroy British naval units, they would. And one of the handicaps, a bit like Napoleon in the Napoleonic Wars, Hitler was not really, how can we say, au fait with using naval assets. Okay, Hitler, like Napoleon, believed that the war would be won or lost on land and that the Navy was useful but not decisive. So, first of all, we're going to look a little bit at how the Germans attempted to use their surface units as part of their strategy in the early part of the war. So the Germans had obviously a history during World War I of surface raiders. We, of course, remember the Emden. We remember the Admiral Graf von Spee, the actual person himself, and what they had been able to achieve. And so Admiral Raeder, who at this time was the commander-in-chief of the German Navy, decided that he would send out the surface units of the Scharnhorst class, for instance, and the so-called pocket battleships, which were really very large, heavy cruisers, carrying 11-inch guns, out into the sea lanes. And in the early part of the war, this was fairly successful. Until, of course, the Graf Spee, one of the pocket battleships, was caught by Ajax, Achilles, and Exeter off the South American coast. And even though it only sustained what you would probably call light damage, it was forced into Montevideo Harbor, and the British did a very successful deception campaign. There's an excellent 1950s movie about this, about the sinking of the Graf Spee, where the British fooled the German skipper and the German high command into believing that outside Montevideo Harbor was a full fleet with aircraft carriers, the battle cruiser Renown, 5 heavy cruisers, etc., when really this was not the case at all. And probably if Graf Spee had come out to fight, it may have defeated pretty much what was left out there. Anyway, that was not to be, and Graf Spee was scuttled, and of course Hitler was not very happy about that. Okay, we know that there were merchant raiders. Of course, our own HMAS Sydney was eventually sunk in 1941 by Cormoran, but there were many others as well. And Atlantis was another famous one. So they were able to sink 700,000 tons of shipping up to 1941, which of course was pretty good and much better than the pocket battleships and the Scharnhorst class. So it's unbelievable that Admiral Raeder, who was still in charge of the German surface fleet, decided, well, let's put our most valuable battleship and a very good and seasoned crew on the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen on a shakedown cruise, which will be like a, shake the battleship down, get everything ready, train the crew a little bit more, and do some raiding while they did it. And of course, they were wildly successful to begin with when they sank the pride of the British Navy, battle cruiser Hood. But this was not going to last. And the Royal Navy were not going to put up with the loss of Hood. And Bismarck was, as we know, sent to the bottom. Prince Eugen escaped, luckily for them. And Hitler loses more confidence in his surface fleet. And coincidentally, by 1943, Hitler would want the surface fleet to be scrapped, but Dönitz, who was the U-boat commander and now the commander-in-chief, would change that opinion. Okay, so speaking of Admiral Dönitz, what's his claim to fame? Well, he was a U-boat man through and through, a very skilled and seasoned submariner during the First War. Between the wars, he emphasized always the importance of U-boats. And realistically, during World War One, as the Royal Navy themselves knew, the U-boats were the most effective sinker of tonnage, not just using torpedoes, but laying mines. There were a number of very important Royal Navy ships, including a battleship that was sunk by mines that had been laid by submarines. The German U-boat force before World War II is quite small. But like many military and naval units that are small, they are highly trained, they are seen as an elite force, and they have that heritage from World War I of the U-boats. They will wage what they call a tonnage war. In other words, we will strive to sink more Allied ships than they can build. So if we can sink more tonnage than they can actually build, eventually we will win the war. So as I said, it's a small part of the German Navy, and they have less than 30 ocean-going U-boats operational at the beginning of the war. They have a slightly less number of coastal boats and mine-laying boats. So probably altogether around less than 50 submarines all up. At the beginning of the war, the U-boat skippers will use what we call the lone wolf tactics, meaning that solitary U-boats will prowl around the sea lanes looking to attack merchant shipping. Not only that, but the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, will also take part in the Battle of the Atlantic for quite a while until the Allies can sort out their air power. And as you see there at the top, there is a Type 7, I think, U-boat. I can't see because this silly thing has not disappeared off my screen. And there is a Condor, 4-engined aircraft that the Germans use for long-range bombing of Allied convoys. Here we have a map that shows the expanse of the campaign during this time. Obviously, there were other areas such as the North Sea convoys up to Murmansk to help the Russians, and also right down into the South Atlantic and into the Indian Ocean. But the main area of the Battle of the Atlantic was this area between the United States across the North Atlantic into Britain. The green lines show the extent of air power that can be launched from land from the United States or from Great Britain. And you see there in the beginning, in the middle, a light brown area between those two green areas, which is the area in which the U-boats are able to pretty much operate without being under threat from Allied land-based air power. Okay, so there are a number of incidents at the beginning of the war. The first incident in 1939 is that a passenger liner, the SS Athenia, is sunk. Luckily, not with everybody aboard, not as many people killed as in Lusitania, but still, this is a bad look for the German U-boats. It's bad propaganda, and Goebbels, the propaganda minister, of course, tries to make this out to be a false flag operation, and really, of course, it was the British who sunk the ship, and they're blaming us, etc., etc. And isn't it interesting that today we can see very many similar propaganda operations going on in the world around us? However, it's not all plain sailing for the British Navy either. Now, in World War I, the British decided what they would do before the convoys is to send out squadrons of ships to hunt down U-boats. And these so-called hunter-killer groups in World War I consisted of obsolete heavy cruisers. There was a very famous or infamous episode in World War I in 1914 at the beginning of the war, where 3 armored cruisers was sunk by a U-boat in quick succession within the matter of a couple of hours, with the loss of many lives. And the commander of that squadron told the Admiralty, we are not a hunting squadron. We are a live bait squadron, and we're going to be destroyed. And they were. Now, you would think the British would have learnt their lesson, but at the beginning of the war, they sent out HMS Courageous, which was a very valuable aircraft carrier at this time, with a few destroyers, and they went out pretty much almost into the same area that the 3 armored cruisers had been lost in the war before. And of course, a German U-boat saw this massive target, and the Hunted sunk the Hunter, and Courageous was lost right at the beginning of the war. A very stupid thing. But there was more to come. The British fleet, like World War I, sailed to Scapa Flow. Scapa Flow, of course, was the main naval base for the Grand Fleet in World War I and what they called a home fleet in World War II. One of the big units, one of the battleships of the home fleet, was HMS Royal Oak. And one evening, a U-boat skipper called Gunther Preen was able to get through the torpedo nets and obstacles that guarded Scapa Flow. He came within almost point-blank range. He fired a spread of torpedoes. They hit, or 2 of them hit, Royal Oak, and they weren't sure up on board what was going on. They thought, you know, they must have hit something, some piece of flotsam or jetsam must have hit the ship. They then started to go down, and then Preen had enough time to turn around and put another torpedo in and escape. And of course, you don't get much more major fleet unit than a battleship. And not only had Britain in the first, I think the first month or 6 weeks of the war, lost an aircraft carrier, they had now lost a battleship as well. But of course, the main task of U-boats was the tonnage war, to sink Allied merchant shipping. In the first years of the war, or the first months of the war, I should say, the German U-boats were able to pretty much surface close to merchant shipping and sink them by gunfire. During this early part of the war, they would observe the rules of war, cruiser rules as they were called, and they would hail the ship. They would tell them to stop transmitting by radio. They would allow the people on the ship to get into their lifeboats, and they would then sink the ship. And actually, there are a number of situations where the U-boat captains were very humane indeed, and would leave supplies and water with the Allied sailors, or the Allied merchant sailors. And even on one occasion, there was a slightly larger merchant ship that was carrying passengers, and there were like 3 or 4 of these lifeboats, and they were all chained together, and the U-boat took the lifeboats in tow and sailed them towards, I think it was the Spanish coast, and left them not far from the coast, and even radioed the Admiralty where they were to come and pick them up. Now, this sort of chivalry, this sort of, how can we say, gentlemanly behavior would very soon cease to exist. The war was becoming more serious on all fronts. But not only that, the German U-boats would be forced to attack without warning. Like, again, in World War I, the Allies started to build what were called Q ships. Q ships were merchant ships that carried guns, that were disguised as merchantmen, but as soon as a U-boat came close, they would drop the sides, the guns would come out, and they would sink the U-boat. So the orders went out, okay, there will be no more of this gentleman's war. Not only that, but the U-boats would now start to hunt in packs. As the Allied convoys started to begin, the Germans realized the best chance to sink more shipping was to hunt in what they would call wolf packs. And so you would get anywhere from 3 to half a dozen or even more submarines being vectored in to a certain convoy, attacking from um, different directions, and even attacking despite this so-called protection of the convoy from these very primitive and early escorts. So, for instance, on the left, you would see here the old American destroyers. Again, there's a very excellent movie called Gift Horse from the 1950s, English movie, because, as they say, you never look a gift horse in the mouth. And the Americans supplied 50 of these four-stacker World War I destroyers to the Royal Navy for convoy work. Of course, the British had to give up some things for that. And the actual British sailors called them pack of woodbines because the four stacks look like um, cigarettes sticking out of a packet of woodbines. And on the right, Coastal Command of the RAF had these Anson aircraft, but these measures were largely, how can you say, rudimentary. They were not the best equipment, and certainly the Anson had a very limited range, but it was a start. So the U-boat packs would then hunt at night. They would get into the convoy, and because of their low silhouette, because they didn't blow smoke, and they were hard to see at night, they were able to attack convoys on the surface. So they would line up their torpedo tubes on a pack of ships, and you can imagine if there's a convoy of 50 or 60 ships, you can fire a whole spread into the whole lot, and you're sure to sink, 2 or 3. Mind you, they were also looking for the biggest ships. Tankers were very important, and anything that looked like a troop ship. So this was really dangerous, and it was during this time that the U-boats scored many successes. If we look at this map, we can see that from May 1940 to the end of 1941, so that's less than 2 years, over 900 Allied merchant ships would be sunk, 4,300,000 tons of shipping. So each one of those green dots is a major ship from a convoy that was sunk. And you'll even see that there are some red dots because the Italians had submarines as well, and they also got involved in sinking Allied shipping. So the ships were being sunk faster than they could be replaced. And this so-called happy time was looking like a big success, and the tonnage war was slowly being won by the Germans. So the convoy system needed to be shaken up. And this would happen, first of all, by the Admiral Sir Percy Noble being appointed to what we call the Commander-in-Chief of Western Approaches. In other words, that part of the North Atlantic sea lanes that approached Britain. Okay, so his important reforms were, first of all, instead of just, okay, we're going to have a bunch of merchant ships here and they're all going to sail in a ragtag kind of way, and we'll have some destroyers or whatever circling around. This was not good enough. So there needed to be specific tactics, there needed to be specific training, and air support needed to be, how can we say, effective, not like haphazard. There had to be a proper system. Another reform that he instituted was that instead of, saying, okay, which destroyers have we got available? Or that one and that one. Okay, we need another one. Oh, we'll get it from over here. Now, if you're going to fight as a squadron of ships or a group of ships, you need to be trained together to fight as a team. And this was one of his stipulations that was a must, that any escort groups needed to be formed into a proper trained fighting team. As well as that, air bases that would try and pierce that area in the middle of the Atlantic to give air support would be established in Iceland and later in the Azores. And while this was done, it was still not enough air support to cover every part of the North Atlantic. Here we see a diagram that shows how these convoys were now being organized. And one of the things that they realized was that destroyers, while they are very effective warships, were needed elsewhere. Destroyers were needed by the home fleet, by the Mediterranean fleet, by the numerous forces in other parts of the world. And so at first they would use trawlers, armed trawlers, and then later on they had what we call the corvettes and the frigates that were being built. They were very small warships. For instance, our famous river class and town class corvettes were similar to those that the British used. They used, I think, what they were called the flower class. Anyway, there could be, as it says there, anything from 40 to 160 merchant ships in a convoy. So obviously you needed a good system to do this. Oops, too fast. All right, now, part of these convoy escorts was supplied by the Royal Australian Navy. So it's not something that you hear about a lot. And HMAS Australia, which was actually the flagship of the Australian fleet, was sent to the Atlantic and Britain early on in the war and took part in a number of actions, notably off Dakar, off the west coast of Africa. But it also served as a convoy escort in the early part of the war to try and protect convoys from those major surface German units that appeared early on in the war. But the main type of Royal Australian Navy ships that served in the convoy in the Battle of the Atlantic were the N-class destroyers. Again, a class of ships that you don't hear about very often. So these were fairly modern British destroyer designs. They were manned and crewed mostly, not all, but mostly by Australian crews. And HMAS Nestor is probably the most famous of these ships. It was part of the hunt for the Bismarck, and it was able to sink a U-boat, U-boat 127, off the coast of Portugal while escorting a convoy. Unfortunately, Nestor would be lost in the Mediterranean not long after that, off the coast of Tobruk by being bombed from the air. Although for a while there, it looked like she may have survived, but unfortunately not. Now, one of the big steps that would help not just the convoy system, but the winning of the Battle of the Atlantic was the capture of this Enigma code machine. Okay, so the Enigma machine was captured by sailors from HMS Bulldog and HMS Broadway. And of course, if you've ever seen that Hollywood movie, I can assure you they were British sailors who captured the Enigma and not American sailors in what they call U-571. So the British sailors were able to do that. They recovered the machine as well as the codes. And this was sent to really what was the beginning of the Signals Intelligence Unit at Bletchley Park, which would become known eventually as Ultra. But this was early days yet, and it would take them a while to work out the codes. And once they were able to do that, it would assist greatly. Anyway, we'll come back to Ultra a little bit later in the presentation. But the Germans weren't having it all their own way. The three highest scoring U-boat skippers, Gunther Prien, the man who sunk the Royal Oak, Joachim Schepke, and Otto Kretschmer, were all sunk in March 1941. This was called the Black Month for the German U-boat aces. As you see there, between the three of these guys, they sank nearly 1 million tons, a lot of ships by themselves. Okay, so Prien and Schepke were killed, and Kretschmer was captured and spent the war as a prisoner of war. Okay, in 1941, as you see there, Pearl Harbor was attacked, and now America comes into the war. So what about America? What can they contribute? Well, the fact is they had already been contributing destroyer escorts into American waters and out of American waters and almost halfway across the Atlantic. They weren't at war with Germany in the early part of 1941. This only happened, after Pearl Harbor. However, American ships, American destroyers and escorts had been attacking and being attacked by German U-boats. So this was already happening as far as the Americans were concerned. But as we all know, the Americans like to do things their own way. And Dönitz had an idea that maybe the Americans are not really up to the job. The British were being very effective, or beginning to be very effective. So let's go off the coast of America and see what we can do against the Yanks. And as you can see here, there's a lovely photograph of New York, the skyline. And this was captured and photographed, actually a film taken from a German submarine that sailed into New York Harbor. Completely unmolested. And if you go onto YouTube, you could probably find this. It was part of a German newsreel, the German Wochenshow, or German Weekly News, as they called it. So the United States, you can see here, there's no blackout anywhere along the east coast of America. In another situation, a German submarine was able to surface only a couple of 100 meters offshore and could easily see the street lights and cars driving along and trains driving along. And so therefore the Americans didn't seem to be that prepared. The Americans didn't believe in convoys to begin with. Like the British at the beginning of the war, they thought they were going to send out their hunter-killer groups and they're going to hunt the U-boats down. And of course, this just played into the hands of the Germans, and the Germans started what they call Operation Drumbeat, which in German is Fall Paukenschlag. And it's funny because Paukenschlag means drumbeat, but Pauch is a muscle, your stomach, I should say, and Schlag means to hit. And you could almost translate it into a punch in the guts. And that's certainly what the Americans were now about to receive. So 15 Type 9 U-boats, the Type 9 was a long-distance U-boat, were sent over to operate off the US coast. They were also supplied, so they didn't have to try and have to sail all the way back to Germany. There were a number of other U-boats, and you can see there on the left, a smaller U-boat, which what they called a milk cow, that would supply fuel and food and water, etc. And these Type 9 boats then operated off the coast, and they were able to take, as I say, a big toll on the Americans. Churchill wrote, "The U-boat attacks of 1942 were our worst evil." And as you can see there on the left and on the right, the proof is there in the photos. Dönitz actually said, US coastal cities are now witness to war and their tankers burning. And at the bottom there, you can see that during the second happy time, during Operation Drumbeat, 7,800,000 tons of shipping was sent to the bottom. This is inconceivable in our time, something like this happening. But in those times, there were a lot more merchant ships. Merchant shipping was the lifeblood of all trade and, of course, of all supply during the war. So things are becoming extremely acute for the Allies. They must win the Battle of the Atlantic or they're going to lose the war against Germany. Why? Well, first of all, supplies are essential to Britain. Britain, like in World War I, is starting to starve. Not quickly, but if they don't get what they need from the Empire and from the USA, the amount of gardens they were planting in people's front yards and backyards and the limited farming area in Britain would not be enough to sustain the population, let alone the growing presence of soldiers, etc., who are now being based in England. The sea lanes to all other theatres of war needed to be kept open. So it's just not about the supplies, but the British have an army that's fighting in North Africa. Okay, and eventually now, after Pearl Harbor, fighting to begin with in Burma and Singapore. These armies need to be supplied with reinforcements, ammunition, and all the things necessary to wage a land campaign. The United States was now building more and more aircraft, ships, and in those days, the USA really was what we would call the arsenal of democracy. This term was given out by an American statesman. I think it was Dean Acheson or Averell Harriman when he was trying to sell the Soviets on Lend-Lease. And this term stuck and it still is used today. Unfortunately, it seems that the USA is not so much an arsenal of democracy these days. I hope they are, or we'll see. Okay, Operation Bolero. So if you're going to invade Europe at Normandy in 1944, you're going to need a whole bunch of American and Canadian soldiers. And Operation Bolero were these troop ships. And some of these troop ships included Cunard liners like the Queen Mary and the Queen Elizabeth, as well as much smaller ships, the Mauretania, the sister ship of the Lusitania, and many others. These ships had to be protected in convoy. Lend-Lease war material, as I said, to Murmansk to help the Russians, very important, because the Russians were taking the brunt of the German army on the Eastern Front. And some people would say that really, although, of course, America and Britain and France played a large part, that really was the Russians who defeated Germany on land in World War II. And of course, finally, denial of resources to Germany. Now, you would think, what resources are the Germans getting? Well, the fact is that the Germans were sending large, long-range submarines to places like Japan, their allies, all the way across the other side of the world, because the Japanese had rare earth materials, they had rubber, they had some other resources that were unobtainable in Germany. And in return, the Germans would give them technology. I think they even dismantled a Tiger tank, a Messerschmitt 109, a Focke-Wulf 190, and sent those inside a submarine to Germany. Okay, so the mind boggles. How do you send a Tiger tank that weighs 60 tons inside a submarine? That must have been something. Okay, so one of the things that needed to be done was they needed some new shake-up of command at the Western approaches. Okay, so Percy Noble had done a wonderful job, but they needed somebody who was a little bit younger and who, if you'll pardon the expression, was a bit of an ass kicker. And Max Horton was certainly that guy. Not only was he a brilliant mind, he was an submariner. Well, yeah, ex-submariner. He's an admiral, so obviously he wouldn't be in charge of a submarine these days. But he had that insight into how do you beat submarine warfare? How do you win against the Germans? So he had that insight that was really important. So, as I say, there, his energy and drive resulted in the improved performance of convoys and escorts. And the Germans started to find this out. They started to find out that things were starting to get a little bit different. And actually, Horton himself went to sea a number of times to actually see a convoy and escort in action. So he didn't just sit around in an office, he was really a doer. And what about technology? Well, technology was forging on. Now that the Americans were in the war, the flow of information and technology between Britain and America, backwards and forwards, meant that the scientists on both sides were able to improve upon things like ASDIC, which is also called sonar, in other words, listening for submarines underwater, and for radar. Okay, so radar is important too. I mean, it's not important if the submarine is underwater, but it's important if the submarine is above, on the top of the water, because submarines could not stay under indefinitely. Not only that, but radar is important for early warning of approaching German aircraft. Because even up until 1943 and early 1944, German aircraft were still based in France, and they were still able to fly across the Atlantic and attack merchant shipping, especially as they got closer to England. Now, other technology, of course, I mentioned Ultra before. So the Ultra operation grew and grew, and Bletchley Park was to see the installation of these gigantic mechanical computers, analog computers, I suppose you'd call them, that were called bombs. Okay, BOMBES. And these were really basically calculators that calculated probability from the information that was fed in as to what the ciphers and codes would be. So that's just one of the machines that you see there. There were many of them, and I think they still exist, although perhaps I'm pretty sure they wouldn't work anymore. So this operation, and a lot of it was done by women, by the way, not just operating the bombs, but code breaking. And women seem to have an excellent, how can we say, insight and intuition. Maybe it's a woman's intuition, but this would help very greatly in breaking German codes to find out the movements of U-boats. Some of the weapons were being improved as well. So instead of just rolling depth charges off the back of your ship, which would explode with an almighty thump in one area, what became known as squid and hedgehog would be able to fire these underwater mortar bombs, and these would fire in a spread. And if you have a look at the photograph on the right, so if you're a submarine that's hiding underneath the water, underneath that destroyer somewhere, well, you're going to be bracketed left, right, center, front, and forward by high explosive. So this would seal the fate of many a German U-boat. As I mentioned before, the shipbuilding, especially in America, again, the arsenal of democracy in World War II, but also in Britain, up in Scotland on the Clyde as well, to a certain extent, were building these escort vessels, corvettes and frigates. The Americans had their own versions as well. And below that, the Liberty ship. Liberty ships could be, and remember, the Germans were trying to win that tonnage war. Liberty ships could be put together, some of them, in a matter of weeks, which was unheard of. Usually would take a bit longer, probably, 2 to 3 months, which is like in shipbuilding virtually nothing. And so the building of these Liberty ships would greatly increase Allied tonnage and therefore start to put the kibosh, shall we say, on the German U-boat campaign. 4-engine long-range aircraft, such as the British Sunderland on the left and the US Liberator B-25 on the right, were being operated by Coastal Command and the Americans too, by the way, although not the Sunderland. And that was really starting to close the air gap, and they were able to engage German aircraft such as the Condor, those that were left by 1943 and 44. The Sunderland was especially feared by German aviators. They call it the flying hedgehog because the British, a bit like the Americans, stuck machine guns sticking out everywhere on this aircraft, and they were, unbelievably for their size, fairly maneuverable, and they could hunt down German airplanes and shoot them down. But the biggest weapon that the Allies could use was the escort carrier. So the escort carrier meant that you could have air support over your convoy 24/7. In other words, you could have aircraft, and I really mean 24/7, because towards the end of the war, they had night fighting capabilities, so the aircraft could actually take off at night. But mostly, of course, in the early days, the aircraft, to begin with, probably, the old string bag swordfish and things like that. But by 1944, the British and the Americans were operating more high efficiency aircraft, such as the F-4, the British called them martlets, but they were, of course, Wildcats in the American Air Force, and also the Avenger torpedo bombers that could bomb Allied U-boats, German U-boats. And so this was the real winner for the Allies in the Battle of the Atlantic. And so this shows you what could happen. Air attack by escort carrier aircraft. Now the U-boat hunters were the hunted. And just in time too, because the Germans were now developing, and you got to hand it to the Germans, when it came to technology, if they had been better organized without Hitler changing his mind so much, they could have had weapons that could have won the war, maybe won the war, or certainly made the war last much longer. And I'm thinking now of the V2 rockets and the Messerschmitt 262 and Heinkel 162 jet fighters, and this, the Type 21 U-boat. Okay, the Type 21 U-boat did not need to surface, or if it did need to surface, it could stay underwater for like weeks at a time. Not only that, but it was high speed. Its hull form would be the basis for the Americans to use for their post-war submarines. And it was a revolution. This is a true submarine. Okay, so the U-boats and Allied submarines were really what you would call submersibles. The Type 21, thank God for the Allies, only about 2 or 3 of them came into service in the last weeks of the war, and they were pretty much ineffective simply because they came too late. So in May 1945, the U-boats surrender and the Atlantic battle is won for the Allies. And peaceful seas, and of course, now the Pacific. And here are some of my sources that I used.
Thanks, Kez. That added a lot to my understanding of what happened there. There were several things. I didn't realise the escort carriers, etc. But great coverage. Thank you.
Yeah, it's the Battle of the Atlantic is not something that is covered much here in Australia, obviously because we didn't play much of a part in it, I suppose, compared to the Americans and the British. But it was an extremely decisive campaign, and the escort carriers were intrinsic to winning that campaign in the last year of the war.